We are about to hear David Foster Wallace talk about his own philosophical career. And once that's over with, we're going to have a discussion about his philosophical career. And I will give you guys some biographical information and do an analysis on how I view David Foster Wallace as a philosopher. And if you guys don't know, Right Conscious is the headquarters of David Foster Wallace content on YouTube. So subscribe if you want to see some more, and I'll see you after the clip.
Your dad is a professor of philosophy.
Yeah.
He was a protege of George Will's father, who also taught same school, same department, and considered him
Well,
as an influence on his life.
Dad's been at the University of Illinois since the early 60s, and when Dad first came, Fred Will, who's now, I think, in his 70s, was, maybe in his 40s or 50s, and was a guy of major stature. And he was nice to Dad. And I think most junior academics, this is what happens, is, you find older people in the department whose intellectual approach is congenial to you and who are nice to you, and you kind of become friends with them. I was a philosophy major in college, but my areas of interest were mathematical logic and semantics and stuff, which my dad thinks is kind of gibberish. So it's very weird. In a certain way, I'm following in Dad's footsteps, but I'm also doing the required, thumbing the nose at the father thing. And the stuff that I was doing was really more math than it was philosophy. And I don't know whether I would have taught. If you're good enough at that, they just kind of put you in a think tank and let you write on yellow paper.
So when David Foster Wallace was at Amherst, he was considered a philosophical genius. Everyone around him thought that he was going to be one of the next best things in philosophy. First of all, as we heard, his dad was a professor of philosophy. His mom was a very great writer and grammarian. So David was raised in a heavily intellectual environment. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be smart and going to be a genius. And Wallace's weird idiosyncrasies that we love and that get displayed in his fiction writing, I think fueled the early part of his philosophical career. Because as an undergrad, when you have no responsibilities from 18 to 22, you have all this energy, and it's not the most impossible thing in the world to become a philosophical prodigy or to be the best kid in your philosophy department. But to go all the way, to get a PhD in philosophy, to walk the walk, to actually create waves in a realm like philosophy that is very saturated, then that is a pretty hard task. And so when Wallace was at Amherst, he wrote a thesis titled Richard Taylor's Fatalism and the Semantics of Physical Modality. I won't tell you guys that I've read this because I've tried, and because I'm not into this stuff, there's no really worth in reading it to really enhance your understanding of Wallace. But his philosophical thesis, and really his only published piece of work in the philosophical realm, shows us that when Wallace commits to something, he's going to go all the way with it. When you look at the 10-year grind or so from when Wallace graduates from Amherst until he releases Infinite Jest, Wallace releases The Broom of the System, a bunch of short stories, and eventually Infinite Jest. And he was working pretty manically at this time. And if he wasn't working, then he was off womanizing, doing drugs, trying to sober up, or whatever escapade he was doing. But what's also interesting to know, I think the pressure of being in philosophy was too hard on Wallace, because around his time in Amherst, he started to do more drugs. He had been doing drugs since high school, cigs, drinking, weed, but he really started to turn it up at university, especially during his later years. And this is actually what opened up his mind to fiction writing. He had dabbled with fiction writing before, taken some classes and whatnot, but really smoking the ganj helped him see kind of the postmodernist style and vision that we would eventually love him for. And I think this was a relief, because in the last 2 years of Wallace's university career, which was, I think, around 5 years, because he did take time off. He took, I think, 2 semesters off because he was having mental breakdowns. He came across a paper by Richard Taylor named Fatalism. And basically the paper contended that none of our actions or decisions or thoughts really have any effect on the future. And so Wallace really didn't believe in this philosophy as like his own worldview. But when it came to Taylor's philosophy, Taylor went about making this argument in like a very straightforward manner. And that's what Wallace couldn't wrap his head around, because most of the time when you read like deep philosophical stuff, it's very complicated. But Taylor's paper, his propositions were very simple. And so Wallace couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. And that's what sparked his interest. Like he was seeing these very simple propositions and these logical flows. And he understood that, he disagreed, but he didn't know how. And because it was simple, it pissed him off even more. And so that is really the reason he started diving deeper into his thesis. And Wallace was very well equipped for this argument because what the fatalists were trying to do, especially Richard Taylor, was he was trying to not make his argument a metaphysical argument. Because, in the metaphysical aspects of philosophy, it's a whole other realm. Richard Taylor's fatalism is actually more so trying to make a semantical argument, make a logical argument. And that was Wallace's realm. And so from what I can tell him, from what I've read, is that Wallace did a very good job of picking apart the entire argument and like basically destroying Richard Taylor and his thesis. And what does that mean? Nothing very much. But, when a 21-year-old, 22-year-old kid is taking out a very distinguished, philosopher and throwing fire and destroying one of their arguments. And once again, you can see a lot of potential. And I think this gave Wallace a false sense of confidence because for years he abandoned philosophy. And eventually, as I'm sure you know, he tried to return to Harvard to get a PhD in philosophy. But the problem is that Harvard didn't admit very many people every year. Like over 500 people, or close to 1,000, if I remember correctly, submit applications every year, but less than 10 get in. And so Wallace was one of these people, and he only lasted a couple weeks because once he was back in it, he realized like, wow, this is like way too deep for me. And judging from what I can see about Wallace, he really doesn't like that autistic or that very linear side of himself because he really isn't a metaphysical philosopher or a Zizek type guy. It seems like if he's going to be doing philosophy, he's going to really dial down on something. But why not dial down on characters or on fiction, which is much more fun and honestly much more profitable and would lead to a lot of the things that Wallace was seeking. Wallace was very interested in the women, in attaining at least some level of fame, as much as he likes to deny it. And in philosophy, that would have been impossible for him. But in fiction, he was able to get with all the women and have guys like me talking about him now.